Sam Daly-Harris is a big champion of all this stuff in the West, at least. And it's not that I think the microcredit doesn't work. I did my PhD on this stuff, so I think it's when it works, it's really is fabulous. But to the extent it is a technology, right, which is to say a way of addressing a problem of overcoming the absence of collateral that poor people have and the sheer cost of lending to poor people who don't have collateral and assets that they can offer. I think there's only so much further as an intellectual project that can happen. There's tweaking at the margins, but there's not going to be another microfinance revolution. The revolution was just getting it from something pretty small, something that was a global movement. I don't think there's going to be a huge role even for the World Bank, really, in terms of being a champion as such of microcredit. But for that sort of thing to keep working, it's going to be largely driven by Axiom and other types of NGOs that have just championed microfinance as their particular thing, which is fine. If that's what they want to do, that's great. That's what I can say. All right, any other last minute big questions? 1, 2, and then we'll probably have to go on this. Right.
It sounds like your approach is less complicated and more about talking to people, getting to know people, and hearing what they have to say. How does that relate to your choice of approaches to sociology as opposed to numbers?
Okay, good. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
2 questions. You mentioned that in your introduction that excessive inequality is bad. That's true. But we also know that equality in poverty is no virtue. So have we figured out some way of identifying the optimal level of inequality? That's consistent with what the chair wrote. And my second question has to do with, I guess, this idea given by Pritchett and others, which is a very provocative idea, and that is development is really ultimately about people, not about places. And do you support that idea, and shouldn't we be supporting, for example, unfettered immigration and perhaps unfettered internal mobility of the poor, instead of just focusing on this official government-to-government or agency-to-government development aid relationship?
Yeah, that's a framing co-author of mine. The whole point, that support sector of immigration point there largely comes explicitly from his work and from talking with him at length about these kind of issues. I'm a sociologist, right? So I believe that sociology is about people, not about persons. It's about groups of people, right? Because we live as groups, we define ourselves by members of groups, we rank order ourselves by our peers, whether they be our friends here at college or anyone else. So my unit of analysis tends to instinctively be towards the groups rather than individuals or geography as such. None of that means we shouldn't care about immigration. It just means we should recognize that there are social processes that largely drive the immigration question as much as they just individuals responding to wage differentials across boundaries. On the inequality question, I guess my answer to that is formed by being part of the World Development Report 3 years ago on inequality and development, which I had the privilege to be on. And largely, our story from that particular report was that they were using sort of Sen type language, was that there were intrinsic and instrumental reasons to be sort of worried about inequality. We can be worried about inequality just because we care about distributions in and of itself. We just think it's bad that fat cat hedge fund managers in New York can make billions while the rest of us have to scramble to pay off their mortgages, and then they can screw up the whole system. We care about that just so we think it's wrong. But if you don't like that answer, then the empirical answer was that actually economic growth was faster in countries that had lower levels of inequality, which is to say poverty reduction itself was faster for any given rate of growth. You get a higher poverty reduction impact if you lower the level of inequality. So whether you're against inequality just because it violates your principles or your religion or whatever, you can be against it for that reason. If you're a strict empiricist, then I think you can be against inequality because it matters for consequentially for other kinds of things that we care about. I didn't mention in my introduction that I am the the only sociologist amongst in the research department of 100 people in the research group in Washington. So I'm a statistically insignificant member of that group. But I've made a living there of sorts by being able to try and sort of show that the social and economic things, whilst they are different on many key issues, can often be very complementary as well. So they can be complements as well as substitutes to use the economic language. In stressing these relationally intensive aspects of service delivery, in particular with respect to healthcare, with respect to education, I think all I'm doing there is really just stressing the realities of how those services are delivered. Right? Education is delivered in a relationally intensive way because it is. That's the way education is done. I don't think that's necessarily a sociological perspective, but by stressing these relationally intensive components, we're trying to bring back here not just the reality of that's how it's done, but trying to use that to ultimately to try and provide more pragmatic solutions to these big kinds of questions. And that was just to shamelessly promote another WDR, the development report 2004 on service delivery, where we were very much explicitly were trying to incorporate these social dimensions of accountability and service delivery in particular, is because that has made sense in terms of trying to respond to the very real questions of why school enrollments were so low in countries like India, for example, where you have Indian Administrative Service agents presiding over a system that was dysfunctional, even though the IAS officers themselves were the brightest people on the planet. To become an IAS officer, you have to pass an exam with a telephone foot thick level of exams. I mean, these are some of the smartest people in the world operating a system that has managed to get enrollment rates in India over the last 15 years from 6% in the early 1990s, despite 8% growth, up to 7% overall that time later. Right? So it's not just a matter of getting more smart people into these particular positions, and it's not a matter of just throwing more resources at these things. It's about trying to respond to these relationally intensive components. On any given day in Bangladesh, 70% of teachers just don't show up for work at all. Right? So, why is that? Because the relationships of accountability at the local level mean that teachers, all their incentives and all their structures are coming entirely from ways that are not governed by their sense of obligation to their community, and the community itself has no way of being able to exercise leverage back against them. Right? So those social components, I think, are just ultimately part of a pragmatic attempt to try and respond to the problems as we encounter them. All right, my body thinks it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I think I should go to bed. Thank you all for coming out.
What? What? That happened a lot. People walking out. I changed tapes already. Come to see us.
I like your little